So, I don't know what degree you got after all that activity.
I got a first.
You got a first?
Yes.
See, I got a second. So. Anyway, congratulations. And
it was a rather strange. I remember it was a very bad year. Only 8 got first or something, and I did have a long set to in the Viva with Trevor Roper about because I was very keen on Anal at the time, and he thought I was just making it up, so we had to go through what I'd.
Did you go to John Cooper's lectures?
Yes, he also had. He didn't have a go, but he wanted to quiz me that I really did understand what the Ricardian theory of rent was about.
Because he was keen on Anal and he used to lecture on.
He was good. He was good.
Good lecturer. So, and then you, how did you go on? You went on to Nuffield.
Yes, myself, Roderick, Angus, we all decided that Nuffield was the place, and Roderick and I decided that Habakkuk was the person we wanted to be supervised by, so we chose him, much to his surprise. And Charles went off to the diplomatic corps. Angus wanted to become an economist, so again it was, well, in some ways the sort of ethos of Nuffield was very narrow. I realised in retrospect what a liberation it was coming here and talking to scientists who are interested in larger questions of the world and and that they could talk in a comprehensible way, and obviously literature people and everything else, whereas in Nuffield it was just the social sciences, and that could be a bit oppressive. But having said that, there were some good people there. It was an intellectually stimulating place. But by that stage, I mean, I knew I wanted to carry on doing research, but I also thought London was going to be much more exciting than Oxford. So partly that's why I chose London as being my PhD DPhil's topic. Originally I was going to do something on self-help. Why was it that, because it was sort of provoked by the sort of, I suppose, New Left background, but why was it that in 1906, the people voted for liberalism in a big way, when, if you went back to Chartism and before, then liberalism was sort of under great suspicion. So I was interested in how liberalism become a popular creed, and it was originally going to be around Samuel Smiles, and then as I read into the stuff it became clear that the place where it wasn't working at all was London. So that was the intellectual background, together with some French work. There's someone who's the author I'd be able to tell you what, but called Classe Laborieuse, Classe Dangereuse, or something like that. Chevalier was?
Yes.
Anyway, that was another of the triggers, as it were. And then meeting these French anthropologists also sort of helped me broaden the way I thought about it, particularly charity, which until then had been written in a fairly boring, worthy sort of way, but not a terribly exciting way. And that was but at the time I was sort of undecided, or leaving it open, let's say, whether I would carry on in academia, or whether my fantasy was that we'd set up a sort of journal a bit like Libération, one of the sort of French progressive sort of journals. And we did try in the sort of 67, 68, but I think it folded after 12 issues. But it was the idea that it was going to be Libération, but also Paris Match or Picture Post. I mean, the idea to bring radical photojournalism and sort of leftish news together. so that didn't work. But at the same time, I began to get more and more uncomfortable with the New Left lines, particularly the sort of more Trotskyist. I mean, people are talking about having a revolution in Europe, and I really didn't think we needed that. I think I was a sort of crypto-Fabian, actually. So one of the things I did was, having finished Outkast London, or I got a commission to write on Engels. I did that because the agent said, look, you could do Engels, Queen of Scots, which was the what's her name? That sort of biography. The idea I'd write a very readable biography was sort of thing. Whereas my feeling was, it'd be easy for me to stick to London and Victorian history. If I was going to broaden myself at all, this was the moment to do it. So, on the strength of this advance, I managed to get learn German, and eventually got a Humboldt scholarship. So I spent a year in Frankfurt, again in sort of rather interesting time, because it was just at the end of the SDS and the Baader Meinhof.
This is about
73,
yes.
Something like that. So that was fascinating, although I also thought that they were sort of crazy. I mean, in the sense of, I kept saying, well, actually, what's been happening in Britain is quite interesting. But they said, no, it's the Italian Spring. There was, factory occupations and sort of terrorism, which I didn't. I never. I mean, I knew some of the people who were involved, but so it's a very interesting moment. And that film that's recently come out, Baader Meinhof, I found was really good, actually. It brought a lot back, and the sense in which, just bad mistakes on the part of the authorities can just push something, change gear altogether. So, and at the same time, I'd got a job in. That's right. It shows when university cuts began, about 73, 74. I think I'm right in saying I was beginning to run out of the advance and all the things, so, and the Humboldt had come to an end, so I needed to get a job, and I applied for this job in Essex. Actually, I think it was in the sociology department, and I got it, but they said, well, the good news is you've got the job, but the bad news is that it's frozen. So
was Geoffrey Hawthorne there then?
I think he was still there then, yes. And after about 3 or 4 months, I was beginning to get worried, and anyway, sort of college job in King's came up, so I applied for that. And then, of course, they unfroze the job and said, well, you can have it if you like. By that stage, however, I was both charmed by King's, obviously, and the fact of having a job in history rather than sociology appealed to me too, although I'd been quite keen on sociology in the 60s. I felt more comfortable with history, and obviously as time's gone on, I felt that more strongly.
Can we go back to two or three things? One is Habakkuk.
Oh yes.
Hrothgar. What was he like as a supervisor?
He was fairly hands-off. I mean, it was still a time when one supervisor tended to give you a glass of sherry once a term rather than what we now think of as graduate supervision. And he had his own hobby horses, but he wrote this marvellous book about migration of labour and capital between America and Britain, which was really good. And his own lectures I thought were good. He was not what I expected when I did get to know him a bit. I mean, he was quite sort of unassuming Welshman, really. And it was John Hrothgar Rhys, Habakkuk Rhys.
Yes, he went to the same school as Keith Thomas.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Barry Grammar School.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. But actually, of course, he only published, I think, a small fraction of what he'd been doing, because he was in All Souls, and you just noticed these boxes and boxes of things which were sort of half-finished or quarter-finished books. So he did know a lot. And when I remember he was very good when the first section of my book was all about how the labour market worked and this sort of thing, and he really had some very useful, interesting things to say. I mean, the other person I should mention is, of course, at Nuffield there was Max Hartwell. And he was very keen to set up a little sort of school around him. I mean, I was quite fond of him, but there was obviously a lot of tension between he thought he ought to get the job and sort of things like that, and then when Peter Mathias got it, he even wrote a piece saying, "This is the inaugural lecture I would have given had I got the job." But it did mean, because he was at Nuffield, that there was a little group of economic social historians who he patronised and sort of supported, so that was good.
Did you know Brian Harrison as well?
Oh yes.
I'm seeing him in a few weeks.
Well, he's
he influenced me enormously. His method,
I thought he wrote a great book on temperance at the time, and he was someone who at first seemed terribly square, if you see what I mean, and gradually sort of, I don't know whether it was over time or just if you knew him better, but anyway, unwound. And I remember because in the DMB he asked me to do the obituary or the entry on RAF, I suppose I kept it fairly formal. And they said, "But do tell us more about how inspirational he could be." And so there was a side of Brian which was very open to the sort of heterodox and the sort of unfamiliar, even though he didn't look like that at all. And he was a good thing in Nuffield, because really there was him and what's her name? He's written all about the British welfare state and social policy at the time.
He or she?
She.
Not Jill Thomas, no.
No, she wrote a big biography of Beveridge.
Yes.
And she's done various stuff on the poor law, the welfare states and so on. Her name will come back and I can fill you in for the recording. But anyway, the point is, she and Brian came into Nuffield as research fellows together. So there was really quite a strong, interesting history group there.
The other thing, you whisked over Outkast London, but that was presumably a version of your thesis which was turned into a book for a more general audience, and if you remember that a while back, could you kind of summarise what the main argument was and what you think was important about it?
Yes, I think it seems strange now, because it's such a different historical epoch in which what we now think of as neoliberal ideas were thought of as part of some bad old Victorian days, and one was interested in at what point they were challenged. As I say, in Outkast London, my aim was partly to show why the question of poverty and underemployment was a dominant problem in Victorian or pre-1914 England. I was particularly interested in it because I looked at stuff on Rio and sort of various, the whole idea of the shanty town and the third world was in my mind when thinking about casual labour. And strangely, no one had really done much systematic work on it, although I did find some American economists in the 30s who had sort of worked quite interestingly on it. I used that. It was also a period which I now regard as sort of, God knows why I did it all, but when it was thought that a quantitative estimation, would make history into a much more exact science. So I did all this work on the censuses, which actually, most of which proved fairly irrelevant. I mean, so you could divide the London population into 5 registrar general classes, but actually didn't explain anything about how London worked. On the other hand, there was work done by geographers, which I found very, very inspiring, about the location of industry, the location, so you could do street maps and show why industries cluster in particular areas, how local labour markets work. A lot of that had been done in the 50s and 60s, and I built on that. And then I was interested, I was sort of on the... I was never quite a Marxist, but I was interested in the sort of problems which I thought Marx raised up. And so I was quite enthusiastic. Another of the sort of influences, of course, in the 60s on the New Left was Althusser. And I was particularly interested in Althusser because, against the idea of people simply expressing class interests, and that's what ideology was, he had an idea which, of course, has an afterlife, which is in terms of discourse, but then it was called a problematic, and it meant that it set up in a much more Saussurian way a sort of set of relation between signs, which you could still at that point connect with a class, if you like, or sort of build a class around the discourse of thing. So when the third part, I was trying to explain how you got from different ways of thinking about the social problem in London, and it starts with demoralisation, which is a classic liberal idea that of a sort of poor law kind, that people should, if they don't practice thrift and so on, that they're going to gradually go down. That they should save, they should, that they could survive if they manage their incomes, etc. And then in the 80s, it becomes much more social Darwinist idea of what was called degeneration. It was the idea that the city dweller was degenerate, that London was drawing in good country types, and sort of if it went on like that, and there was all this sort of demonology about you never meet a third generation Londoner who isn't sort of imbecile or something. So I was interested in how these discourses change. I didn't use the word discourse at the time, but that's what it looked forward to. I was still trying to connect it with a sort of social class sort of analysis. I did so in a loose enough way where it didn't really matter, I don't think, in the end. But and I was interested in, under what conditions does this idea that poverty is a fairly insoluble problem apart from charity and so on, does that go away? And of course I had a very simplistic answer at the time, which was simply the First World War, got full employment for a bit, and it wasn't the same problem as before. And when you came to after the First World War, then the trade unions were organising things, there wasn't the same casual labour problem, etc. So that was part of the background, and I was interested too in the way in which historians had focused very much on the Industrial Revolution, the North, etc., and I wanted to show that actually the South was the more exciting thing to study anyway in the second half of the 19th century, and why London had this amazing reputation. And of course the East End at the time, even the time I was sort of a student, still had a sort of aura of difference about it. And, the Toynbee Hall sort of and a sort of London Labour tradition, and obviously just the other thing, which is just good fortune, was marvellous documentation. You know, the Mayhew and the Booth material. You know, you couldn't fail to make it an interesting piece of work, really.
Tell, I mean, this is one of your major pieces of work. Tell me how you work. I mean, do you tend to go for walks, or do you listen to music while you're working, or do you have your ideas in the bath? What do you have any advice on creative writing, working?
I definitely go for a walk whenever I can in the afternoon, although that's more in recent years than then, probably. I use periods of insomnia to try and work things out. Sometimes, although very often I regret that I didn't, I have a notebook beside my book bed and just sort of jot down the odd idea, some of which turn out to be very good, you know, sort of odd thoughts one's had in the middle of the night. I tend to, I'm very old-fashioned in the technology. I mean, I use handwriting. I take extensive notes. I mean, I write the thing on the computer, but make sure I get them printed as quickly as possible, because I don't really
when
trust.
You say you use handwriting, but then you say you use the computer.
Oh, sorry. When I'm taking notes,
yeah,
it's all handwritten.
Yeah.
And my first sort of idea of planning the thing will be handwritten. So it's just when I get to actually write a chapter or whatever it is, I'll do that on the screen.
Do you use, like Brian, do you use little cards or?
Oh yes, I've got loads of the 8x5
cards, one fact, one card stuff.
Yes. And that I've still got the cards I had for Outkast London, so I've used that method all the way through. And I'm very backward. I mean, I'm learning, but I'm sort of fairly backward on the internet. I mean, sort of, I'm used to going to libraries and looking things up, and then people say, well, why didn't you look at Wikipedia or something? And very often it's true, I could have saved myself time. So I'm gradually shifting in that direction, but it's fairly slow and a bit resistant.
Right, well, let's move on then to coming to Cambridge. You, I think, you came in what, 73, 74?
Yes.
A couple of years after I came here. I mean, you didn't know Cambridge very well, you knew Oxford. Were there things that struck you as odd about? I suppose you knew a number of people in King's. You'd known Hobsbawm and maybe John Donne or...
Yes, I mean, the thing was that my competitor was Robert Skidelsky, but I got the job here, and at the time, I mean, like Eric Hobsbawm said, look, I've got a little influence in King's, I've got no influence outside King's. And it was true that, I mean, the thing that was slightly shocking when I first arrived was how conservative the faculty was. That, you know, King's was a sort of beacon of enlightenment, really, and I felt, you know, very comfortable here. I mean, I felt nervous to start with, just would I be up to it, sort of thing. But once that feeling had passed, I thought, you're just very lucky. This is sort of my sort of atmosphere par excellence, if I could choose one, because you had these wonderfully... Well, I say one of the things that surprised and delighted me was just to find out, you know, to meet scientists and on the electors. I mean, that was again a very illuminating experience for me, because, you know, people like Sydney, you can imagine, I mean, they could give you a wonderfully graphic picture of what this dissertation was about, what the background problem was, whether this was worth studying or not, or if you took Bernard and sort of his contempt for, you know, just the sort of routine linguistic philosophy, and so that people who Balliol thought were the best thing since sliced bread, he could just side through and say, but it's trivial. So there's all that sense of assured intellectual confidence, which I suppose at the edge could look like arrogance, but I mean, on the whole, well, the arrogance that produced Wynne, who thought he could sort of
Wynne Godley,
do the alternative forecasting to the Treasury, But I rather admired all that, obviously, and it was it's like we were talking just now about whether the college should introduce various bureaucratic schedules, renewal, and so on, and that was so different in those days. No one would have dreamt of anything like that. And if you trust, and people did trust each other, I think, and a lot of things were done. That was the other great liberation, I think. I mean, in Oxford, I'd been a research fellow, so I didn't really have any administrative duties. But coming here, finding so many things were just done by word of mouth or on the telephone or informally. You didn't have to have a great paper chase over everything. King's also gave me the opportunity. We set up, in those days, social history was still regarded as a bit sort of outside polite society as far as the faculty was concerned. So we set up I set up with Jeff Ely and David Blackburn, actually, a social history seminar, which we had originally pioneered, Raphael, myself and Tim Mason in St Anthony's. Anyway, so I set up one here, and that became a sort of alternative focus of innovative work, sort of 18th to 20th century, and got a very large, in the 70s it was very, got a large crowd of people, and so there was a sense in which, again, what I talked about before from 56 onward, the sense of forward movement, things taking in questions no one had asked before, or sort of expanding the horizons. There was the feminism, there were new takes on empire, there was sort of black history, there were all sorts of things which were beginning to happen. Although my own taste was more as, well, in the end I got a job, I don't know whether what was cause and what was effect, but when I did get a faculty job, it was in intellectual history, which wasn't my original, as it were, what's the word? I mean, I liked it all the time, and I did it with pleasure in Oxford and the rest of it, and I always thought that was part of, but I just thought it was part of being a historian. I didn't go for all this sort of stuff which so-called Cambridge School have had about how it's a very special, a rarefied set of skills. I mean, I just think any decent historian would use those skills when asking those sorts of questions. However, I mean, there was a whole group of us who did the social history, and that carried through to the mid-90s before it ended. When King's eventually said, well, I think you're well enough established now, I don't need to support an independent seminar. I think it was Tony Tanner who sort of decided that, who I was very friendly with. No, so King's I've always found a very decent place. When I had the misfortune of trying to move house and got caught in the sort of Lawson budget about 1988-9 or something. Anyway, I found myself on a bridging loan for about 8 or 9 months. It was very unpleasant. Michael Cowdy, who was the bursar, gave me an interest-free loan for 2 years. The sort of thing which I can't imagine. Not only King's, but any academic institution would feel empowered to do these days. So that sort of informality and trust is something which I've liked most about Cambridge. I think Cambridge is a strange place because it's nearly all immigrants from one place or another, with some rather resentful locals, as it were, underneath it all. So in some, I mean, Quentin, you know, for instance, said,
Quentin Skinner.
Yes, Calvinism without God, and there is a certain amount of that. I mean, there's no, there really isn't a culture of sort of port swilling and this sort of thing in Cambridge. I mean, the Puritanism has somehow survived, and obviously I greatly respect that because it doesn't produce the sort of old corruption that occasionally Oxford did. On the other hand, there's something which can sometimes be a bit icy. So we've got when my parents died, they had a sort of enlarged cottage really in the Wye Valley. So we spent it's a place called Langrove, which is between Ross and Monmouth. It's beautiful country, it's between the Forest of Dean and the Black Mountains.
Lovely.
And so we spend quite a lot of time there, and I've always enjoyed the idea of having two temporalities going. I mean, whether for a long time I lived in London, that even though I taught in Cambridge, so that was nice to have two identities. And then since the 90s I've lived more or less exclusively in Cambridge, but to have this other place in the country, again, it's a sort of just a very different pace of existence and set of preoccupations than the one you get here. So, and I value both of them. It's not that I want to retire to the country. I'd get bored stiff, but to have it always as a part of my life, I find, I couldn't imagine anything better, really. So
Cobsbawm has a house.
Yes.
Around there, doesn't he?
Yes, his is sort of
near Hay, I think.
Hay, yes, between Hay and Bilth, something like that.
Yeah.
No, I've been there. It's a glorious place, really.
You mentioned Quentin briefly, but there's this intellectual history stream. What about John Donne? Has he played a part in your life?
Yes. Well, probably John was one of the main people
who got you here,
who got me here. So, and he's always been very supportive. His book on Locke still remains quite justifiably a classic, and sort of, sometimes he's not mentioned in the sort of pantheon, but I think he definitely should be. In its time, his book on revolutions was also a very good, innovative thing, and for years I taught on that. And it was part of a sort of intellectual expansive-ness of Cambridge at the time that SBS and history were able to partake in that. He also was very supportive when I had this idea of setting up something on the history of political economy at the research centre, and he very much associated himself with that. So, I mean, all along, I think he's played a good role in the college. I mean, I wish he'd hone closer to history sometimes, but
you can't have everything.
No, quite.
Tell me something about your collaboration with Emma Rothschild.
Yes, we had. I mean, I've known Emma since the 60s. We were, undergraduates together, although she came at the age, some ridiculous age, like 15, so actually we were a few years apart. And then she went and lived in the States, and she got a job in MIT. When I was in a position to do so, I think we set up some research fellowships in politics in the college, and I encouraged her to apply, and she got one of them. And our initial idea was that she had done quite a lot of work on peace and war in Sweden. I forget what the institute was called, but anyway, we had this idea that whereas obviously the technology of war had changed immeasurably since the ancients, thinking about war and peace hadn't changed that much. So we first set up a seminar, I think, about war and peace. People like Miles Burnett, I remember, giving wonderful talks on violence in antiquity and this sort of thing. And from there, and the other thing was that obviously economics, particularly with the passing of the sort of Keynesian generation in Cambridge, was getting more and more mathematical and technocratic and nerdish sort of thing. So as a counter-move, we wanted to try to re-establish the position or the essential importance of history as part of economic knowledge, as it were. So that was, and then she has wonderful connections, as you might imagine, with major funding organisations, and particularly in the United States. So we got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to kick off, and from there we set up this centre. Again, the idea was to create studentships which would encourage students who did economics to learn some history, and vice versa. That sort of doesn't operate quite as well now, because since the coming of the MPhils and so on, people find other ways of doing that. But we still give money to support, for instance, anyone who's a postgraduate who wants to learn a language in order to pursue their research, because again the danger is the whole thing is becoming much too monoglot, really. And it's a bit like in recent years, like Herbert Morrison or something on the Labour Party, socialism is what I happen to be interested in at the moment. It's a bit like history and economics, that we if people come up with a sort of interesting exciting idea in the general area, and we can find funding for it, we will. And then we've appointed research fellows in some years, and she has been quite influenced by another part of the anal tradition, which is the mentalité, I think, because it's between intellectual history and cultural history. And what we've also thought, you see, the Quentin, John and all those people, it was always 16th, 17th century, it was always a small conversation between elites, so although it did pay attention to context and everything, it was quite a small context which was involved. We were interested in extending this into thoughts about economy or commercial society, or whatever one might call it at the time. And also, particularly once you get to the 19th and 20th century, you're dealing with mass readerships and mass opinion, and so you need a broader definition of what sort of history this is, which will be somewhere between intellectual, cultural and political history, or whatever, of economic thought in its context and its relation, of course, to the economy itself.
You then went on, well, not then went on, but simultaneously you were writing a book on poverty.
Yes.
For Profile.
That's right.
What was that about? Poverty is a big subject. It was confined particularly to Britain, poverty in Britain, was it? Or
no, it's Britain and France, with a little bit on Germany. But basically what it was trying to say, it was written as a riposte, in a sense, to neoliberal arguments that Adam Smith, as it were, was best expounded by Milton Friedman, and to argue that there was no direct genealogy which led back from Chicago School or Mrs. Thatcher or whatever to Adam Smith, that in between there came the French Revolution, and that the first disciples of Smith were actually sort of radical, and he had various quite critical thoughts about law of entail, inheritance, etc. Also this strange position which you can't actually align either to left or right very helpfully, which is the grandiose ambition which you find in history, and at the same time the vanity, sort of stoic sort of the vanity of riches and so on. And anyway, I wanted to show that, and obviously it was a critique of empire at the time, so to show that Smith's thought was quite critical in many areas. I don't make much claim for novelty in that. Got some of it from Emma and some of it from other stuff, and was developed. I then wanted to look at how it's developed both in France and Britain, and in Britain the way in which Paine, for instance, in some sense was a reader of Smith, but of course in 1792-3, Paine gets burnt in 500 villages and towns up and down the country. So, and I wanted to also criticise the way in which, say, Malthus was very often taught as being. Malthus says he's a critic of Condorcet and Paine and so on. Actually, he hardly touches Condorcet. It's really Godwin. So he gives a false sense of being opposed by utterly naive people. I spent some time on Condorcet to just show that there was a new social thought which came along with the French Revolution. It was connected partly with the development of statistics in the 18th century, using calculus and the way in which that gets connected with life tables and life expectancy, and that this is, in a way, the origins of national insurance. And to show that that was part of the early vision of the French Revolution, it gets hit very hard on the head. Obviously the French state is more and more financially encumbered and incompetent, goes bankrupt anyway. So, and also if you look in Britain, round about the mid-90s, it's still on the agenda with Pitt and various people having poor or reform ideas and so on. It becomes anathema in the reaction against revolution, particularly as stated then by Malthus and so on. So I wanted to show that this was the first systematic thoughts of a non-utopian kind of how to deal with poverty, but that it gets, as it were, pushed into the long grass or persecuted out of existence, and how it's replaced by what we now come to think of as political economy in a more orthodox sense. And I looked in particular at people like Jean-Baptiste Say in France. However, I was interested too in showing the where the idea of the Industrial Revolution came from, which again was France rather than Britain. And through this school of Jean-Baptiste Say and so on. So, and then of course it gets picked up in the end by Bismarck, and then through to the new liberals in Britain. So it was partly, the other motivation behind the book was, that the left, intellectually speaking, had got so identified with a sort of Marx, Engels, etc. tradition. I wanted to show that there were other ways in which one could be radical and progressive, and that this was one of the lineages, if you like, which had been forgotten and needed to be retrieved, particularly against, as it were, sort of neoliberal orthodoxies.
Thank you. And now you're recently retired like me, but teaching a certain amount. Actually, I didn't ask you about teaching. Did you enjoy the kind of Cambridge tutorial lecturing style of teaching?
Well, what was an immense privilege, I think, was to supervise MPhils and PhD. Over the years, that almost doesn't feel like work. In the sense that obviously there's some who were hard work, but a lot of them you were getting, at least I felt, one was getting as much back from them as they were giving to you, as you were giving to them. So I've had a marvellous run of students. I was going to say I've got a sort of mixed feeling about sort of supervisions. If they're in groups of 3 or 4, I think that's fine. One-to-one, as I say, can be a bit tiresome. I think we're very lucky in Cambridge with our seminar system, because it just means so many sort of wonderful people from all over the world are passing through, and it's there at your doorstep, and so much so you almost take it for granted. But we're very lucky, in fact, to have such positions. And I mean, the only thing I would say where things could be a bit more liberal, I suppose. I mean, I've now got a retirement part-time position in Queen Mary, and the good thing there is you can devise an MA option. I've done one on the shadow of the French Revolution in the 19th century, and you take 4 or 5 people and that's fine. Here in history, I don't know about other subjects, but you get appointed to teach pre-existing paper or papers, and it's very, very difficult to change the syllabus. You have to give 2 or 3 years notice or something ridiculous. So in those areas it could be a bit rigid, I thought, and we need to move in a more flexible direction. And I think I haven't got an answer to this, but I wonder sometimes whether the lecturing system is the most efficient way of conveying knowledge.
Do you like lecturing? Or?
I don't mind it. I prefer giving talks, if you see what I mean. I'm not very good at. I don't think I'm a natural. I don't joke with the audience, or I don't sort of involve them very much. I mean, I give what I have to say, and I'm happy to talk to them afterwards. It's been, on the other hand, it's what people first said to me when I came to Cambridge. It's not so much for the students, the lectures. It's to make sure you know your topics, and it did force me to get up rather systematically a whole cluster of subjects which otherwise I'd have just sort of waffled on about rather than knowing about. So that's to be said in its favour, I think.
And then to return to what I was saying, I mean, you're retired now and you're doing some teaching, but are there projects, I mean, there must be projects that you now hope you will have time to pursue?
Yes, I'm now trying to, well, I've got a particular project which I held the first session of little conference last week on 1848 as a turning point, particularly in political thought. More generally, what I'm engaged in doing is trying to write a sort of intellectual but general biography of Marx, which is taking the sort of contextual idea seriously. So, I mean, I think the Marx we've inherited is an invention of the sort of 1890, 1920 period. So I'm trying to get back to a cohort of people who, for whatever reason, think what they do in the 1840s, and to show the fragility of the lot of the thought and the misunderstandings which have given it this sort of canonical sense. I'm not wildly trying to prove something else. I'm trying to bring the whole thing back to a sort of proper study of history, and to show its sort of its contingent factors, and also it's not just intellectual history. I've got an idea about the familial relations which are fascinating. I think I've got very interested in his father and sort of and the fact, of course, that I think it's a story of hubris. It's something which seems to sort of have a lot going for it in the 40s, and then he gets into this critique of political economy, which he thinks is going to be the absolute answer. So, as he gets into it, he I think he finds it doesn't work, but the problem is that his wife the only reason why she puts up with this disorderly way of life and lack of income, so he's writing the great book, right? And this is also Engels' view. So in a way, he's a prisoner of their expectations. So he can't say, sorry, this was a mistake, or, you know, I can't
it's like
go on with this.
George Eliot novel, isn't it? Or,
well, it's a bit like
Casaubon,
I thought. It has a certain tragic quality because he doesn't speak to anybody about it, but he gets all these psychosomatic symptoms, boils and God knows what. So, and the other thing is that he reverts to a sort of utopian socialist view, because he gets more and more seduced by this idea of the primitive communism and sort of Mutterrecht, and sort of his main opponent in latter years is Henry Maine, because Henry Maine starts with patriarchy, but there was a more democratic
Blockhead Maine.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, I think there are some new and interesting things to say. It's a bit tough at the moment because I'm just having to sort of rehearse, you know, the history of German idealism to sort of get the thing straight. But anyway, basically I enjoy it, and there are 2 or 3 other sort of unfinished books in my filing cabinet waiting to be attended to if I get the chance. So on the whole, I'm quite happy with what I'm doing.
Well, I'm sure you will get the chance, and on a last sip, not of wine but of water, thank you very much indeed, Gareth. That's lovely.
Thank you, Alan.